The night the president almost died, the only man in the room who could save him was the one everyone had been taught to ignore. The white surgeons saw a bleeding head of state and a risk to their careers. The black doctor saw something else entirely. A human body he understood better than any of them, and a decision that would either kill him on the spot or make him, for a few brief months, the most dangerous kind of man in America. A black man the president trusted. By the winter of 1864, Dr. Alexander August had grown used to being a rumor in his own city. White doctors in Baltimore spoke his name only in private, usually in the same sentence as the words, "too bold," "too proud," or "doesn't know his place." Black families in the alleys and church basements, however, spoke it with a different tone, half in hope, half in fear, because when a slave needed a bullet removed without losing an arm, or when a Union soldier with dark skin and no influential relatives lay groaning in a charity ward, the rumor would spread in whispers. Find Alexander. If anyone can save him, it's him. Alexander had not been born free, and he had not been born a doctor. Those were identities he had taken the way other men took cities, slowly, methodically, and with a willingness to shed parts of himself along the way. His earliest memories were of Mississippi mud, not Maryland streets, the heavy air of a plantation sickroom, his mother's hands smelling of camphor and vinegar, as she pressed cloths to a feverish child's forehead, while a white doctor shook his head and muttered about weak constitutions in people not built for heat. The child died. His mother did not forgive God or the doctor. She taught her son, instead, to distrust both. He watched her learn things she was never supposed to know. How to lower a fever with willow bark when laudanum failed. How to set a broken bone with strips of boiled linen and wooden splints. How to bring a woman through a birth that had already killed 2 others. She learned it quietly, piecing together scraps of knowledge stolen from white physicians, older midwives, and a dog-eared French manual someone had smuggled into the quarters. She taught it to Alexander the way other mothers taught their sons Bible verses, over and over until he could recite the steps in the dark. He was 10 when she first put a knife in his hand. "Hold it like this," she said, closing his fingers around the handle. "Not like a weapon, like a promise. You cut wrong, boy, and somebody bleeds out on your hands. You cut right, and they get another year, maybe 10. That's all medicine is. Choices with a clock ticking." The clock in Alexander's life started ticking louder when the war came. The plantation fractured. The owners' sons left in gray uniforms. Union patrols appeared on the road. Whispers of escape became plans instead of fantasies. By the time he reached Maryland, through a series of events he rarely spoke about, even decades later, he carried 3 things he refused to let anyone take: a scar on his left forearm from a drunken overseer's whip, a head full of his mother's improvised anatomy, and a hatred of men who believed ignorance was a natural condition for people of his color. Baltimore in 1863 was a city divided against itself. Union flags hung from federal buildings, but Confederate sympathies lived in boarding houses, taverns, and the offices of respectable doctors who treated black bodies as experimental material at best and disposable property at worst. Alexander found work first as a hospital orderly, then as an assistant to a Quaker physician, who believed, quietly, scandalously, that anyone with a mind and steady hands could learn medicine. The Quaker's library became Alexander's battlefield. He read Gray's Anatomy with the same ferocity other men read war dispatches. He practiced sutures on pigskin until his fingertips bled. He stayed late in the charity ward, redoing bandages the white interns had tied carelessly, listening to the way lungs sounded when drowning from inside, watching the way a man's eyes changed in the second before he gave up. There was no diploma at the end of this education, no ceremony, no parchment. What there was, instead, was a growing list of people in Baltimore who were alive because someone had called for that colored doctor who doesn't officially exist. By late 1864, Union officers had begun to hear about him too. The first time Alexander was summoned to treat a white officer with rank, he expected a trap. He arrived at the makeshift hospital in a converted church, his instruments wrapped in a canvas roll he had sewn himself, and found a captain from Maine on a blood-soaked cot with a shattered leg. The army surgeon in charge, red-faced, exhausted, stood with his arms crossed, as if daring Alexander to fail. "Bones too far gone," the surgeon said. "It comes off in the morning." Alexander didn't argue. He simply asked for hot water, light, and 10 minutes without interruption. He palpated the leg, traced the line of the break, saw what the other man had missed in his haste, a fragment that, if repositioned and fixed, might hold. He worked in silence, sweat rolling down his spine, feeling the old clock from his mother's voice tick in his ears. The next day, the leg was still there. 6 weeks later, the captain walked, limped, but walked out of the hospital on his own foot. Word made its way up the chain the way such stories always did, cautiously, with disclaimers. "He's colored, but he's not officially licensed, but if it's this or amputation, maybe let him look first." Alexander knew what those sentences meant. He was not a doctor when things were calm. He was a last resort when white competence had already failed. He accepted it for one reason. Last resorts got called when the case was almost lost, and those were the cases that mattered most to him. The night in Washington began, like so many of his worst nights, with a knock at the door too urgent to ignore. He had taken a small room above a Negro church on a side street, the kind of place respectable white society never visited unless something had gone terribly wrong. Outside, the city echoed with the muffled thunder of carriages and distant celebration. The war was dragging toward its exhausted end, but there were rumors that Richmond would fall any day. Inside his room, there was only a half-empty oil lamp, a roll of instruments, and a man who had learned to sleep lightly. The knocking came in a rapid, frantic pattern. 3, then 2, then 3 again. Army code, of a sort. Urgent, but not random. He opened the door to find a young lieutenant in a rumpled Union uniform, his blue coat stained with something darker that Alexander knew, even in the lamplight, was blood. "Dr. August?" the officer asked, breathless. Alexander's hand tightened on the doorknob. That title was rarely used without a sneer. "Yes. You need to come with me, now." "Who is it?" Alexander asked. "Soldier, officer, civilian." The lieutenant swallowed. His face was the color of paper. "The president." For a moment the word didn't land. It floated between them like a sound misheard. "The president is ill?" Alexander asked carefully. "Shot," the lieutenant said. "Head wound. Theater box." They brought 2 surgeons, but they're arguing. "Sir, we don't have time. He's still breathing." But Alexander didn't remember making the decision to move. One second he was in the doorway, the next he was at the small table, rolling his instruments into their canvas sheath with fingers that did not tremble as much as they should have. Knife, needles, thread, forceps, scissors. The same tools he had once used in lamplit slave cabins, in field tents, in cellars that smelled of fear. "Where is he?" Alexander asked. "Peterson House," the lieutenant said, "across from Ford's Theater." Of course. Alexander had walked past the theater earlier that week, watching crowds shove toward its doors, never imagining history would bleed out on the pavement there. The carriage ride was a blur of ruts and shouts. Washington at night was a city half in shadows, half on fire with news that had not yet reached all its corners. They passed clusters of people craning their necks toward the theater, soldiers holding them back with rifle butts, voices threading the air. Is he dead? Did they say his name? Who did it? Was it Confederates? Inside the carriage, the lieutenant clutched his cap like a drowning man clutches driftwood. "They said you did something with a skull fracture back in Baltimore," he stammered. "With that colonel from the 5th Massachusetts. They said if anyone could—" Alexander cut him off. "How long has it been since he was shot?" 40 minutes, maybe a little more. Too long and not long enough. Long enough for blood to clot in all the wrong places. Not long enough for the news to reach every man who would protest a black doctor, laying hands on the President of the United States. When they arrived at the Peterson house, the scene was chaos, carved into wood and gaslight. Men in uniforms crowded the narrow hallway. Women sobbed behind closed doors. The air stank of sweat, spilled liquor, and the metallic tang of fresh blood. "Make way!" the lieutenant shouted. "Medical assistance!" A white surgeon in a blood-smeared frock coat turned, irritation already forming on his lips, until he saw Alexander. His expression shifted from impatience to something colder. "This is your assistance?" he demanded. "A colored bone setter from Baltimore?" Alexander met his eyes without flinching. "Where is the patient?" Another man, older, also in a surgeon's coat but with fear instead of arrogance in his gaze, answered. "In the back bedroom. We can't move the ball. It's lodged." So they had already tried. Of course they had. Alexander stepped past them without waiting for permission. The lieutenant's hand hovered near his pistol, not in threat, but as if he expected at any moment to have to defend the man he'd brought here. The room where they had laid the president was too small for history. The bed was narrow, the ceiling low. Oil lamps threw unsteady light across walls hung with cheap prints. In the center of it all lay a man Alexander had only ever seen in engravings and distant glimpses at public addresses. Without the top hat and the distance of a podium, Abraham Lincoln looked less like a monument and more like a collection of contradictions. Too tall for the bed, too pale for a man known for his vigor. His famously lined face gone slack, except for the occasional flicker of pain that rippled beneath unconsciousness. Blood had matted his hair behind the left ear. Someone had cut away part of his shirt and coat. His chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular breaths. Alexander felt, absurdly, that he ought to introduce himself. Instead, he set his roll of instruments on the side table and spoke the only sentence that mattered. "Tell me exactly what happened." The older white surgeon, Dr. Parker, someone said, explained in clipped phrases, the shot from behind, the fall forward, the immediate unconsciousness. They had examined the wound, inserted a probe, felt bone fragments, but could not locate the bullet. They had declared the wound mortal, more for their own protection than his. Even if we could find it, Parker finished, his chances are minimal. Alexander listened, fingers already parting Lincoln's hair, already mapping the skull beneath. Minimal is not the same as zero, he said. Parker bristled. And what makes you think you can do what we could not? Alexander didn't look up. Because you stopped when you decided he was a symbol, he said quietly. I was taught to treat men when everyone else had already decided they were beyond saving. There was a murmur in the hall. Somewhere behind him, a Union officer swore under his breath. Alexander shut all of it out. He had learned years ago that there was only one way to silence a room full of men who did not believe in him: succeed in front of them. He washed his hands in a basin someone thrust toward him, the water turning pink, then red. He asked for better light. He asked for silence. Both were granted, not because the men suddenly trusted him, but because the alternative, doing nothing, was unbearable. He palpated the wound, feeling the shattered edge of bone, judging the angle. He pictured the bullet's path through air, then through flesh. Shooter behind, above, close. Entry just behind the left ear. Trajectory inward and forward. The ball would have ricocheted off the inner skull, plowing through brain tissue before coming to rest somewhere he could not reach without killing the man on the table. This was not a battlefield leg. This was not a simple fracture. This was the brain of the President of the United States. And he had, at best, one chance to make it worse, or slightly less hopeless. "What are you doing?" Parker asked, as Alexander picked up a slender probe he had modified himself. "Looking for the places that can still be helped," Alexander said. "Not chasing the one that can't." He did not intend to remove the bullet. He intended to relieve the pressure. His mother's voice was loud now, louder than the ticking clock. "Pain kills slower than swelling," she had said once, in a cabin that smelled of childbirth and fear. "Blood in the wrong place turns into poison. Your job is to give the body a chance to fight back." He made the smallest incision he dared, guided by feel rather than sight, his hands steady, his world narrowed to the thin strip of bone and tissue beneath his fingertips. He loosened fragments that were pressing where they should not press, allowed blood to escape where it had been trapped, easing the invisible storm inside Lincoln's skull by degrees measured only in instinct. Minutes stretched. Sweat dripped into his eyes. Someone offered to wipe his brow. He refused to break concentration. At one point, Lincoln's breathing hitched, then steadied. Alexander heard Parker suck in a breath. "What was that?" the older doctor whispered. "Room enough?" Alexander murmured, for his brain to remember how to be a brain. When he finally stepped back, the room swam for a moment. He swallowed it down. "I cannot promise you he will live," he said, his voice rough. "But he will not die tonight because we were afraid to touch him." There was a silence so deep it felt like a physical thing. Then, from the doorway, another voice, hoarse, stunned. "Who is that man?" Alexander turned. Secretary Stanton stood there, eyes rimmed red, beard unkempt, every line of his body vibrating with the knowledge that if the president died, history would carve his name into stone as well. "A surgeon, sir," the lieutenant who had fetched Alexander said quickly. "From Baltimore. He's colored," someone else added, as if that were the real diagnosis. Stanton's gaze flicked to the instruments, the blood, the tiny incision. the altered pattern of the president's breathing. "Can he save him?" Stanton demanded. Alexander met the secretary's eyes. For the first time that night, he allowed himself one honest answer that was not shaped for white comfort. "If the president lives," he said slowly, "every man in this house will remember your name." He did not say the other half of the thought. "And if he dies, every man in this house will remember to blame you." Alexander heard it anyway. He had lived too long in a country where black success and black guilt were often written with the same pen. He wiped his hands again, watched the water redden, and realized something else, something colder. Whether Abraham Lincoln survived this night or not, the man who had just touched his brain would never be invisible again. And in 1864 America, that kind of visibility could be as deadly as a bullet. Outside, the crowd still roared questions into the night. Inside, in a cramped bedroom smelling of sweat and oil, a black doctor stood over the most powerful white man in the country and waited to see which of them history intended to kill first. The first time President Lincoln woke up screaming, it was not from pain. It was from memory. He did not remember the bullet, or the theater, or the way his body had gone suddenly weightless in the moment between standing and falling. For the first several days after the operation, Alexander existed in a world that shrank to the size of the room and the length of the president's breaths. He slept in a chair against the wall, waking at every change in Lincoln's breathing, every twitch of his fingers, every murmur from the politicians who moved in and out like ghosts, arguing in whispers about succession, security, and what it would mean if the President of the United States left this world in a boarding house bed, watched over by a black man. Lincoln's recovery was not dramatic. There was no single moment when he sat up straight, made a joke, and proclaimed himself saved. Instead, there were inches, a slightly steadier breath, a longer stretch of sleep without distress, a moment when his eyes opened and stayed open long enough to focus. Alexander measured those inches with a precision that bordered on obsession. Pupils equal, he would note quietly. Grip stronger in the right hand today. Speech clearer. Less slurring on the long words. The white surgeons, who had expected either a rapid death or a miracle they could attribute to Providence, watched his methodical attention with a mix of curiosity and resentment. They had seen head wounds. They had pronounced men doomed after a glance. They were not used to the idea that someone could intervene between fate and the grave and call that intervention skill. On the fourth day, Lincoln spoke Alexander's name correctly for the first time. "Dr. August, is it?" he asked, voice rasping. Alexander, who had been checking his pulse, almost dropped the president's wrist. "Yes, sir." Lincoln studied him the way he studied maps, slowly, missing nothing. His eyes were still clouded by pain and laudanum, but there was a spark there, the same spark that had once read an entire nation and decided to break it in order to rebuild it. "You are not standard issue," Lincoln said. Alexander had heard a lifetime of euphemisms for his existence. He had never heard that one. "No, sir," he said. "Neither are you." The corner of Lincoln's mouth twitched. "Did I die?" he asked. "Not yet," Alexander answered. "I would have mentioned it." Lincoln closed his eyes, the brief flare of humor fading as a wave of pain rolled over him. "Feels like you've left a door open in my skull," he muttered. "In a sense I did," Alexander said. "It was that or let the pressure kill you." He hesitated. "With respect, Mr. President," You've survived worse than a hole in the head." Lincoln huffed something that might have been a laugh. "You sound like you've read my mail." Alexander did not answer that. He had never been allowed to vote, never been invited into rooms where policy was decided. But he had read every newspaper editorial he could get his hands on, every reprinted transcript of the president's speeches. He knew the cadences of Lincoln's public language. Now he was learning the cadences of his pain. Recovery bought Lincoln time. It did not buy him peace. The attempt on his life, and the fact that he had lived through it, made the White House something more dangerous than it had been before, a symbol of both survival and unfinished business. For some, Lincoln became a providential figure, spared by God to finish the work of reunifying the nation. For others, his continued existence was an insult. Alexander saw both reactions up close. 6 weeks after the shooting, he moved from the boarding house into the White House under a title nobody knew quite how to print. Consulting physician was what the official memorandum said. Colored doctor was what the servants called him when they felt safe. Problem was what several senior staff muttered behind closed doors when they realized the president intended to keep him close. "You can't seriously mean to make him your personal doctor," Secretary Stanton argued in one late-night meeting. "I can, and I do," Lincoln replied, leaning back in his chair, one hand absently touching the scar behind his ear. "Every other man in that room was willing to declare me dead and walk away. He was the only one willing to be wrong on my behalf." "Sir, it's not about his courage," Stanton said. "It's about appearances. The country is barely holding together as it is." The sight of the president attended by a Negro physician is the sight of the president attended by the man who saved his life, Lincoln interrupted. "If the country cannot tolerate that, then the country's illness is deeper than the wound in my skull." Alexander heard about the argument later in fragments, the way he heard about most things, in the way servants moved, the way aides looked at him, the way staffers lowered their voices when he stepped into a room. He did not ask to be present when such conversations took place. He knew he wouldn't be invited even if he did. He focused instead on what he could measure. He adjusted Lincoln's laudanum doses to keep the pain tolerable without turning thoughts into fog. He insisted on periods of quiet during which no one was allowed into the president's office. No generals with demands, no congressmen with petitions, no journalists with questions. He taught Lincoln simple physical exercises to keep his muscles from wasting, while his brain continued its slow, stubborn healing. "You're treating me like one of your convalescent soldiers," Lincoln said one morning as Alexander guided his arm through a range of motion. "I'm treating you like a man whose body is trying to decide whether it still belongs to him," Alexander replied. "Your brain is not almost killed and then simply returns to business as usual. It will try to protect itself by shutting things down. We have to show it that the world is still worth engaging." "And if it decides it isn't?" Lincoln asked softly. "Then we make it change its mind," Alexander said. They did not speak, in those early weeks, about race as a theory. They spoke about it as an obstacle. On days when the headache was worst, Lincoln would lie on the sofa in his office with a damp cloth over his eyes, while Alexander sat nearby, reading medical notes by lamplight. "You know," Lincoln said once, voice drifting from beneath the cloth, "I have been called a traitor, a tyrant, a butcher, a saint, and a fool. Negro lover is one of the kinder phrases in that list, but I have rarely seen so many men so thoroughly unsettled as when I asked you to examine me in front of them. Alexander did not look up from the notes. Fear is often more intense when the threat is to pride rather than to life, he said. Your death would have made you a martyr. My success made you a man who needed a Negro. He regretted the sharpness as soon as he said it. But Lincoln only sighed. You are not wrong, he murmured. And if there is one thing this office has taught me, it is that men will forgive many sins more easily than they will forgive humiliation. Humiliation, Alexander realized, was the invisible infection at the heart of the White House now. Some felt humiliated that the Confederacy was losing. Some felt humiliated that the Union had nearly lost its leader to a single gunman in a theater box. And many, many men felt humiliated that a black doctor's name would forever be attached to the story of how Abraham Lincoln did not die that night. Among those men was Dr. Horace Graves, chief physician of the Executive Mansion. Graves was everything Alexander was not. Formerly trained at a northern medical college, white, from an old family whose money had bought him textbooks instead of freedom papers. He was also deeply offended, on a level that had nothing to do with science, by the idea that his authority had been superseded in the most important case of his career. I was not summoned, Graves said, the first time they met in the White House infirmary. He extended his hand as if granting Alexander a favor by acknowledging him. They went to Baltimore before they came to my door. The president was not moved to your infirmary, Alexander replied, shaking the offered hand with the same firm, professional grip he used on anyone else. They needed someone at the theater. That happened to be closer to me. You were not licensed, Graves said. I was not asked, Alexander countered. Nor are you a member of any recognized medical society. I am a member of the Society of Men who are called when your methods fail. The sentence hung between them like a scalpel. Graves smiled thinly. We shall see, he said. Over the next 6 months, Alexander learned to read Graves the way he read symptoms. The man was meticulous with records, attentive to details of dosage and diet. He was not incompetent. He was, however, vain. So vain that the idea of sharing credit for the president's survival was intolerable. At first, that vanity expressed itself in small ways. Graves corrected Alexander's terminology in front of junior staff, as if Alexander had never heard the Latin names for the structures he had been touching since childhood. He forgot to relay some of Alexander's observations to cabinet members who asked about the president's health. He rewrote daily reports so that recommendations Alexander had made the day before appeared under his own initials. Alexander noticed. He filed it away. He had grown up under men whose vanity was backed by whips. He knew the pattern. The pattern became dangerous the first time the president's condition suddenly worsened. It happened in late January. Lincoln had been pushing himself, long meetings about Reconstruction, tense discussions about the future of the South, arguments with generals who wanted to press advantage quickly versus politicians who wanted to punish slowly. Alexander had warned him that mental exertion would tax his healing brain, but Lincoln had waved him off. The country will not wait for my headaches to resolve, he said. That night, the pain struck like a hammer. Lincoln collapsed at his desk, clutching his head, unable to form words. By the time Alexander reached him, his right hand was trembling uncontrollably, and his speech had degenerated into slurred fragments. Graves was already there, pale and flustered. "It's a seizure," Graves said. "We knew this might happen. The damage was too extensive. We can only keep him comfortable." Alexander pushed past him to examine Lincoln. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said. Graves bristled. "I am not one of your field orderlies, Dr. August." "No," Alexander said evenly. "You are the man who was in the room when the president's brain decided it had had enough. Either tell me what it did, or get out of my way." For a moment, Graves looked as if he might call soldiers rather than answer. Then the practical, frightened physician in him won out over the insulted gentleman. He described the onset. Sudden, without warning, no aura, no previous complaints that evening. Alexander listened, hands on Lincoln's skull, feeling again for the line of fracture, the places where bone met scar. "We overtaxed him," he said. "We asked his brain to act like the war never happened. He adjusted the president's position, changed his breathing pattern with simple, practiced prompts, administered a carefully measured dose of laudanum, not enough to drown his consciousness, enough to blunt the storm." Slowly, agonizingly, the tremors calmed. Words returned, first as nonsense, then as sentences. When it was over, Lincoln lay drenched in sweat, eyes open but exhausted. "That," he said hoarsely, "was worse than losing the election." "You didn't lose the election," Alexander said. "I know," Lincoln replied. "That's why it was worse. Losing an election only kills a career. That felt like it wanted to kill me twice." Graves watched all of this with a tight jaw. Later, Alexander found that day's medical report on Graves's desk, waiting for signature. Under primary interventions, Graves had written, "Administered laudanum, adjusted patient's position to reduce intracranial pressure, monitored recovery." There was no mention of the man whose hands had done those things. Alexander stood there for a long moment, the pen heavy in his fingers. "Do you expect me to sign this?" he asked quietly. Graves didn't look up from the other papers he was arranging. "I expect you to remember that these records will be part of the official archive of the presidency," he said. "In 100 years, doctors will read them and learn from them. It is important that they be respectable." "Respectable," Alexander repeated. "You mean white?" Graves' lips thinned. "I mean that history is already chaotic enough without confusing future scholars about who was responsible for what." Alexander realized two things in that moment. First, that Graves truly believed the story of the president's survival belonged to him by right of birth and education, regardless of who had held the knife. Second, that the battle for Lincoln's life was not the only struggle happening in the White House. There was another quieter war underway, a war over credit, blame, and the power to decide, for the future, which names would be attached to which deeds. That war was one Alexander could not fight with scalpels. He signed the report in the narrow margin, not where Graves had indicated, but beside a sentence describing the president's condition. "Observed and confirmed," he wrote. A. August. It was a small act of defiance. It was also a record, his record, that he had been there, had seen, had done. Outside the sick room, the world lurched toward the end of the war. Richmond would fall. Lee would surrender. Plans for reconstruction, fragile and contradictory, would multiply in meetings. Alexander was not invited to attend, but sometimes overheard from the hallway as he passed with his medical bag. He heard the words amnesty, punishment, black suffrage, colonization, compensation. He heard men argue over the fate of millions as if they were rearranging furniture. He treated the headaches those arguments gave their architect. On some evenings, when the pain was low and the mood was right, Lincoln talked to him not as a physician, but as the sort of man he rarely had time to speak with, someone who had lived on the receiving end of policy. "Do you believe they can be made citizens?" Lincoln asked once, meaning the people who looked like Alexander and the millions who did not know his name. "They already are," Alexander said. "You're asking if the law will agree with reality? And if the law does not? Then the law will become another wound that festers." Lincoln was silent for a long time. "You speak like a man who expects to be disappointed," he said. "I speak like a man who knows the difference between being saved and being allowed to live," Alexander replied. The 6 months between the night Lincoln did not die and the spring evening when he did were filled with such conversations, half clinical, half confessional. Alexander did his best to keep the president's body from betraying him. Lincoln did his best to keep the country from betraying itself. Neither man entirely succeeded. By April, the president's scar had faded to a pale line. The headaches came less often. He moved through his days with something close to his old energy. To the men around him, especially the ones yearning for a return to normal, he looked healed. Alexander knew better. The brain, once wounded, never simply resets. It adapts. It rewires. It compensates. It also remains more vulnerable to shocks, physical, emotional, political. When the invitation came from Ford's Theater for a performance of Our American Cousin on April 14, 1865, Alexander advised against it. "Crowds are unpredictable," he said. "Noise, excitement, they tax you. You are not as fragile as you were, but neither are you invincible." Lincoln smiled, a tired, stubborn smile Alexander had come to recognize. "If I let fear of what might happen keep me from walking into a public room, then Mr. Booth has already succeeded, whether he pulls a trigger or not," he said. "I cannot govern a republic from behind a locked door, Doctor." He clapped Alexander lightly on the shoulder. "Besides," he added, "my head is in better shape than the country's." Alexander wanted to insist. He wanted to stand in front of the president and say, "I did not keep you alive, so you could stroll into the line of fire, because it makes a good painting." Instead, he did what the boundaries of his position allowed. He wrote a recommendation for limited stimulation that night. He adjusted Lincoln's medication so that his mind would be clear for the performance. He asked at the very least to accompany the party to the theater. That request was denied, not by Lincoln, but by Stanton and Graves, for different reasons. "We cannot have you standing behind the president like some sort of personal guardian," Stanton said. "It will send the wrong message." "What message is that?" Alexander asked. "That his life matters?" "That he is weak," Stanton shot back. "That he cannot attend a play without his colored doctor hovering over him." Graves phrased his objection more smoothly. "There are appearances to maintain," he said. "The public has only just grown accustomed to the idea that the president is well. If they see you by his side in a theater box, questions will arise. Let the man have one evening as a private citizen." Alexander stood there, medical bag in hand, knowing he was being pushed back into the shadows he had been yanked from 6 months before. He also knew, with a clarity that made his scar itch, that when something went wrong, and in his bones he felt it would. They would not hesitate to drag him into the light for blame. He watched the carriage pull away from the White House that evening from an upstairs window. Inside it, the president laughed at something his wife said, head tipped back, in a gesture Alexander had seen before. The posture of a man who, for a fleeting moment, has forgotten that anyone in the world wishes him dead. In the quiet that settled after the carriage turned the corner, Alexander felt the old clock start ticking again. He did not know yet that the next time someone knocked on his door in a panic, the words would not be, "The president has been shot," but "The president is dead, and they are asking how you let it happen." By the time they came for him, it was already too late for the truth to matter. The president was dead, the city was howling for blood, and the only thing more useful than a real conspirator was a convenient one. A black doctor, who had laid hands on Lincoln's skull, moved in and out of the White House, and understood things he was never meant to understand. That was not a man the system would allow to walk away untouched. That was a ready-made suspect. The news reached Alexander first as a sound, not a sentence. He was in his small room in the White House residence, sorting his notes from the past 6 months, pages of careful observations about Lincoln's headaches, vision disturbances, and patterns of fatigue, when a roar rose from the streets outside. It was the kind of sound he had heard on battlefields and at executions, a collective intake of breath that turned into a single, ragged cry. He went to the window. Gas lamps flickered along Pennsylvania Avenue. People were pouring out of boarding houses and taverns, still in shirt sleeves, some barefoot, craning their necks toward the direction of Ford's Theater. There was no music, no drunken laughter, just a raw, disbelieving chorus. "They killed him. Lincoln. Is he dead? Who did it?" Alexander's hand tightened on the sill. It took almost an hour for someone to come to his door. The knock, when it finally came, was not the urgent, coded rap of a soldier calling a doctor to a crisis. It was slow, deliberate, heavy, a knock that sounded like the back of a rifle butt. He opened the door to find not a breathless lieutenant, but 2 men in plain coats with badges glinting at their lapels and revolvers at their hips. "Dr. August," the taller of the 2 asked. "Yes." "You'll need to come with us." "Is the president—" Alexander began. "Dead," the man said shortly. "Shot in the theater box. Died at the boarding house. You weren't there." It wasn't a question, but there was accusation threaded through the statement. "I requested to accompany him," Alexander said. "My request was denied." The shorter man's eyes narrowed, flicking over Alexander's face, then to the open table where medical notes lay in neat rows. "Funny thing," he said. "You always seem to be where the president is when he's in danger. Except tonight." Alexander felt something cold coil in his gut. "I go where I am ordered," he said evenly. "I am not consulted about security arrangements. I am a physician, not a guard." "That's what we're here to find out," the taller man replied. "Whether that's all you are." They did not let him gather his papers. They did not allow him to bring his instruments. They allowed him only his coat before escorting him down the corridor. The house that had been his patient's residence for 6 months felt different now. The usual hum of staff and officials was gone, replaced by a stunned, hollow quiet. Women sobbed behind closed doors. A congressman sat on a hallway chair, head in his hands, whispering, "It can't be, it can't be," as if repetition could rewind a bullet. Secretary Stanton appeared at the head of the stairs, face ashen, eyes bloodshot. "Is that him?" the shorter detective asked. Yes, Stanton said. Bring him to the War Department. Now. He didn't look at Alexander as he spoke. That hurt more than if he had. Outside, the air was knife cold. They pushed Alexander into a carriage that already smelled of sweat and gun oil. The streets between the White House and the War Department were clogged with people, some wailing, some sprinting, some standing in stunned silence. News traveled faster than horses. Do you have a suspect? Alexander asked, because he needed facts, something to hold on to. The taller detective snorted. John Wilkes Booth, he said. Actor. Known secessionist sympathizer. Walked right into the president's box like he owned it, shot him in the back of the head, and jumped to the stage. Broke his leg making his grand exit. We'll get him. Alexander's hand went instinctively to the back of his own head, fingers brushing the memory of the scar he had once opened there. A shot to the head, he repeated quietly. Behind the left ear, the detective confirmed. Just like last time, they say. Last time. The phrase hung in the cramped carriage like smoke. Alexander looked out at the dark city and realized, with a clarity that made him feel suddenly old, that his greatest success as a surgeon had become part of the narrative of this crime. A president with a history of a head wound, saved by a black doctor once, killed by a head wound. Now, to men who loved patterns more than truth, that was almost irresistible. At the War Department, they did not take him to an office. They took him to a windowless room in the basement. It smelled of damp stone and tired men. There was a table, 2 chairs, and a third chair pushed into a corner for the man who would soon be watching through the small grate near the ceiling. They sat Alexander down, not roughly, but with the practiced firmness of men who had spent their lives putting people in chairs they did not intend to let them leave quickly. State your full name for the record, the taller detective said. Alexander August. Occupation? Physician. Race? Alexander held the man's gaze. Negro, he said. You can write it in all capital letters if it will save you time later. The shorter detective's mouth twitched, whether in amusement or irritation Alexander couldn't tell. How long have you been attending the president? He asked. Since the assassination attempt last December, Alexander replied. Approximately 6 months. You were called then, but not tonight. Yes. Who called you then? Alexander thought of the frightened lieutenant, the carriage ride, the cramped boarding-house bedroom. He thought of the way the other surgeons had bristled when he stepped into that space. An army officer whose name I do not know, he said. A junior staffer in the War Department, likely received the instruction. And who denied your request to accompany the president to the theater tonight? Secretary Stanton and Dr. Horace Graves, Alexander said. The pen scratching on paper paused for a fraction of a second at the mention of Graves's name, then resumed. Did you ever discuss with the president the possibility of another attempt on his life? The taller man asked. Yes, Alexander said. It would have been negligent not to. What did you advise? That he limit public appearances, avoid crowded enclosed spaces, and increase security at events where his presence was announced in advance, Alexander replied. I also recommended that I be present on such occasions, as I am most familiar with the nature of his previous injury. And did he follow your advice? Not entirely, Alexander said. He is the president. He has responsibilities. He understood the risks. The shorter detective leaned forward. Did you warn him specifically about attending the theater tonight? Yes, Alexander said. And yet he went. Yes. Convenient for you, the shorter man observed. Alexander stared at him. In what way is the death of my patient convenient for me? The detective shrugged. Clears your schedule, he said. Opens up certain opportunities. You were the president's personal physician. That's power. Access. Knowledge. A man in your position might be approached by people who don't wish him well. People who don't wish him well approached him in the theater box, Alexander said coldly. They did not need me for that. The interrogation shifted then, subtly, from chronology to implication. They asked about his movements for the past 2 weeks. They asked who he had spoken to in the corridors, what he had overheard in the president's office, whether he had ever been alone with Lincoln late at night. They asked about his past, where he had been born, whether he had ever been enslaved, how he had come to know surgery without a formal diploma. They copied down his answers as if each were a confession. He saw, in the way they exchanged glances, how his life looked when reduced to bullet points in a report. Former slave, self-taught surgeon, unlicensed Negro, had physical access to the president's body, had knowledge of previous head wound, advised against theater visit, suggests foreknowledge of danger. Was not present at time of attack, convenient absence. If he had been on the other side of the table, reading that list about someone else, he might have been uneasy too. Do you know John Wilkes Booth? The taller detective asked suddenly. I've seen him on stage, Alexander said. I do not know him. Have you ever treated him? Any member of his family? Any of his acquaintances? No. Have you ever treated a Confederate officer in secret? Alexander's jaw tightened. I have treated human beings who were bleeding, he said. If you wish to arrest me for that, you should ask for a larger room. The shorter detective's pen scratched faster. Did you ever speak with the president about his plans for the South after the war? The taller one asked. Yes. What were his plans? Alexander hesitated. He spoke of reconciliation, he said, of bringing the seceded states back into the Union with as little humiliation as possible. Humiliation, the detective repeated. Interesting word choice. Did you approve of those plans, Dr. August? They were not mine to approve or disapprove, Alexander said. I am not a legislator. But you are a Negro, the shorter man cut in. And a man in your position might reasonably expect to influence policy. The president trusted you. He spoke freely with you in private. Perhaps you didn't like the compromises he was considering. Perhaps you felt he was not going far enough. Full equality, voting rights, land. He said full equality, the way another man might say infection. Alexander studied his interrogator. If you are asking whether I wish the president to do more for my people, he said slowly, the answer is yes. If you are asking whether I would shoot the only man in power who seemed willing to do anything at all, the answer is no. Words are cheap, the taller detective said. Bullets are persuasive. The hours blurred. They circled the same points again and again, looking for inconsistencies. They produced a witness, a junior clerk, who claimed he had once heard Alexander say, "If this country does not change, blood will flow." I was speaking of the war, Alexander said. It was already flowing. Intent can be flexible, the detective replied. At some point, Stanton himself came into the room. He dismissed the detectives with a flick of his hand and sat down across from Alexander, not as a bureaucrat now, but as a man who had just watched his friend die. The lines around his mouth seemed deeper. His beard was streaked with sweat and ash. "You advised him not to go," Stanton said, voice low. "Yes," Alexander said. "He went anyway." "Yes." "You did not follow." "I was told not to." Stanton's eyes closed briefly. "We were supposed to keep him safe," he said, "all of us. The guard who abandoned his post, the officer who let Booth in, the man who handed him the note instead of reading it, you, me, all of us." Guilt sat between them like a third presence. "I am sorry for your loss, Mr. Secretary," Alexander said quietly. Stanton opened his eyes. "It is not my loss I'm concerned with tonight," he said. "It is the country's, and how the country will react." He leaned forward. "There are men in this building who want to hang someone before dawn," he said. "Booth, if we can catch him. If not, then anyone who was close enough to make a plausible story. A black doctor with access is too tempting for some of them to ignore." Alexander's mouth went dry. "Do you believe I had anything to do with this, sir?" he asked. Stanton looked at him for a long time. "I believe you saved his life once," he said. "I believe you would have tried to save it again tonight if you had been there." He didn't say whether he believed that absence was intentional or engineered. He didn't have to. "But belief is not proof," Stanton continued, "and proof is not always what matters in a city on the edge of panic." He stood. "For now, you will be held with the other suspects," he said. "You will be questioned again. Men whose names you do not know will decide whether your head stays on your shoulders. I cannot promise you protection. I can only promise you that I will not sign off on a rope based on whispers." Alexander swallowed. "That is more than some would offer," he said. Stanton paused at the door. "One more thing," he said, without turning. "The medical records you kept, your notes, are they thorough?" "Yes." "Then they will be seized," Stanton said. "Officially, for the archive. Unofficially, they may be edited. Men like Graves will want the story to read a certain way. If you have anything you want the future to know, Dr. August, you should say it out loud, while you still can. Paper can be changed. Voices get silenced." The door closed behind him with a finality that left Alexander alone with his thoughts, and the faint sounds of other men being dragged through other doors. He was not placed in a regular cell. He was taken instead to a holding room with 4 other figures whose faces he recognized from glimpses in the White House and Washington society: a theater owner, a tailor, a boarding house keeper, a former Confederate courier. They all had one thing in common. They had been close enough to the president or to Booth to be useful. The theater owner stared at Alexander as if seeing him for the first time. "You're the Negro doctor," he said, "the one from the papers." Alexander almost laughed. "I am not from the papers," he said. "I am from the part they never print." The courier smirked. "Maybe now they'll print you hanging," he said. Alexander looked at him calmly. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe they'll even spell my name right." Sleep, when it came, was thin and fractured. He dreamed of 2 beds, one in a boarding house where a president did not die because he touched him, one in a boarding house where a president did die because he was absent. In the morning there were more questions. This time they came with sketches, affidavits, fragments of letters found in Booth's hotel room. They wove a net of names: Booth, Surratt, Harold, Powell, Atzerodt. Alexander's name did not appear in any of the letters. "That's odd," the shorter detective said. "A man as thorough as Booth, planning something this big, and he doesn't mention the president's personal physician even once?" You'd think he'd want to know your movements, unless, of course, you spoke in person. Or unless I was never part of his plan, Alexander said. The detective ignored that. They brought in witnesses who had seen Alexander walking through the White House garden at odd hours to check on his patient. They produced a servant who claimed Alexander had once said, "Some men only listen when blood is spilled," a statement that could have applied to half the generals in the war. They tried, in short, to turn his proximity to power into evidence of conspiracy. What saved him, ironically, was the very prejudice that had put him in danger. In the end, none of the men in charge of the investigation could fully believe that a black man, unlicensed, unlanded, born in bondage, could have been at the center of a plot that complex tool. Perhaps. Pawn? Certainly mastermind. Unthinkable. It was easier and more politically satisfying to focus on the network of white Confederates, actors, and sympathizers who had surrounded Booth. They fit the narrative the public needed. So after days that felt like weeks, an officer came to Alexander's cell with a thin sheet of paper. "You are being released," he said. "For now. You are to remain in Washington. You are not to speak to the press. You are not to leave the city without permission." Alexander stared at the paper. "Am I cleared?" he asked. The officer shrugged. "You're no longer a priority," he said. "Don't mistake that for innocence." Outside, the city had changed. Black bunting hung from doorways. Church bells tolled. Posters with Booth's face, and a reward amount the size of a small fortune plastered walls and lampposts. On a street corner, a newsboy shouted headlines about conspirators captured, trials to come, justice to be served. He waved a broadsheet with an engraving of Lincoln in martyr's pose. Eyes lifted heavenward, one hand resting on a Bible, the other on a scroll labeled Emancipation. There was no room in that engraving for a black doctor standing beside the bed. Alexander realized then, with a dull, unsurprised ache, that his story had already been edited. In the public imagination, Lincoln's death would be simple: a righteous man struck down by a villain. The messy complications of the months in between, the near-death, the survival, the black hands that had held his skull together, would be sanded down or erased. He thought of his notes, now in Graves's possession, and could almost see the ink being rearranged. Patient, treated by Dr. Graves. Recommendations made by Dr. Graves. Emergency measures initiated by Dr. Graves. He thought of Stanton's warning. Paper can be changed. He thought of his own survival. Conditional, precarious. Granted not because he was believed, but because he did not fit the shape of the enemy they needed. As he walked back toward the small room that no longer felt like his, he understood something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Saving the president had not been enough to secure his place in the story. It had barely been enough to keep him from the gallows. The system he lived under had room for black bodies on operating tables and in chains, black hands in fields and in hospitals. It had far less room for black authors of history. And somewhere, in an office he was no longer invited to enter, Dr. Horace Graves was likely unpacking a stack of leather-bound notebooks filled with Alexander's handwriting, deciding which lines to keep, which to cross out, and which to publish, decades later, under his own name. Alexander did not return to the White House after his release. He returned to Baltimore, to the ward where the poor and the unwanted came in on stretchers and sometimes rolled out under sheets. Whatever protection proximity to the president's body had once offered him was gone. Now that same proximity made him a liability, too visible to the wrong people, too easy to point at anytime someone needed an explanation for why history had gone wrong. Baltimore had changed in his absence, but only on the surface. There were more Union uniforms on the streets, more freedmen moving with the cautious gait of people who had been told they were free but had not yet seen that freedom tested. The signs on certain doors still said whites only. The city's hospitals still had separate entrances for those whose skin disqualified them from being respectable patients. In the charity ward, though, nothing essential had changed. Bones still broke. Lungs still filled with fluid. Knives and bullets still did what they had always done to human flesh. Alexander went back to work because there was nothing else he knew how to do, and because healing bodies was the only form of justice he had ever been allowed to dispense. He did not talk about Lincoln. If pressed, he would say only that he had served where he was needed, when he was called. He did not recount the nights in the boarding house, the arguments with Graves, the conversation in which the president had asked him whether the law could be made to match reality. Those details lived only in his memory and in the notebooks that no longer belonged to him. From time to time, a Union officer would appear in his ward with an injury too stubborn for other doctors. They would look at him a beat longer than necessary, something like recognition mixed with discomfort in their eyes. "You're the one from Washington, aren't you?" they might say, voice low. "The one who, you know." "I'm a surgeon," Alexander would answer, "and you are bleeding. Let's start there." He followed the newspaper accounts of the conspirators' trials. He read about the nooses and the trapdoors, and the stiff-necked defiance of men and women marched to the gallows. He read about how Booth had died in a burning barn, shot by a soldier who claimed he'd done it to prevent an escape. He read that the official doctors had examined Lincoln's body, written their reports, and filed them away. He did not see his own name in any of those stories. When he did see it in print, months later, it was in a brief paragraph in a medical journal summarizing various practitioners who had provided secondary care during the late president's illness. The author praised the decisive intervention of Dr. Horace Graves, whose management of the cranial trauma was exemplary, and whose subsequent papers on intracranial pressure will undoubtedly guide future generations. There was no mention of the black man who had cut into bone while white surgeons watched from the edge of the bed. No mention of the modified probe, the incremental release of pressure, the long nights of watching for the first twitch of seizure and the second. Alexander put the journal down on the table and looked at his own hands for a long time. They were still steady. They still knew where to cut and where not to. They still remembered the texture of damaged bone and the subtle pulse of a brain trying to swell its way out of a skull. Those hands would not apparently be remembered. The years slid forward. Reconstruction rose and collapsed under the weight of white rage and political exhaustion. For a while there were federal troops in southern streets and black men in legislative chambers. Then the troops went away, and the legislators were pushed out, and new laws were written that did not say slavery, but accomplished much of the same work. In Baltimore, Alexander watched as black soldiers who had worn Union blue found themselves shut out of jobs they had been promised. He stitched up men beaten for trying to vote. He set the broken fingers of a school teacher who had been taught in an alley with fists and boots, that teaching black children to read was still considered a dangerous act. Sometimes, in the quiet between crises, he would take out a cheap notebook and begin, in cramped handwriting, to reconstruct the notes that had been taken from him. Case: President Abraham Lincoln, he would write. Mechanism of injury: ballistic trauma, posterior left cranial region. Initial presentation: unconsciousness, agonal breathing, unequal pupils. He wrote them the way he had written them the first time, except now there were no signatures to chase, no official seals to chase. These pages were not for the archive. They were for the possibility that someday someone might want to know the version of the story that had not been cleared by men like Graves. He hid those notebooks in places that made sense only to someone who had grown up under laws that punished literacy in people like him. Behind loose floorboards, inside false bottoms of medicine chests, sewn into the lining of an old valise. Even in anonymity, he was cautious. He treated white patients when they could not avoid him, when infection had advanced too far for their preferred physicians, when amputation threatened them with permanent disability. Some of them left his care and then told themselves it had been the laudanum, or Providence, or their own strength that had saved them. He let them. The older he grew, the more he understood that the story of any cure could be told in two ways: as a record of cause and effect, or as a comfortable myth that preserved the dignity of the powerful. His own life had become an example of the second type. He never married. There was a woman once, a teacher from Pennsylvania with eyes like flint and hands that could coax meaning from frightened children. But she wanted to live in a world where their children would not have to be careful about who saw them reading. Alexander, who had spent a lifetime ducking blows meant for people like that, could not promise her such a world. So he stayed with his patients and his notes. In the 1880s, a younger black doctor from Howard University came to observe at the charity hospital. He had a degree, a real one with Latin on it. He had read, in his textbooks, about new techniques for managing cranial injuries, drainage methods, pressure monitoring, careful staging of interventions. "They call it the Graves Protocol," the young man said one evening while they washed their hands side by side, based on a series of cases from the war years. Brilliant stuff, ahead of its time. Alexander stared at the soap swirling down the basin. "Do they say where Graves learned it?" he asked. The younger man frowned. "No, I assumed he developed it himself." "Assumption," Alexander said softly, "is a dangerous habit in our profession." The young doctor looked at him, unsure whether he had been rebuked. "Why do you ask, sir?" he said. Alexander dried his hands. "Because blood remembers what paper forgets," he said. "And sometimes it takes a century for anyone to bother asking which hands actually held the knife." He did not explain further. The young man left a year later, taking with him a sharpened sense of how fragile a black doctor's career could be, and how much of their work would have to be done without the promise of credit. Alexander's own end came not in a riot or at the end of a rope, but in a rented room above the same church that had first given him a bed in Baltimore. He died in 1891 after a brief illness, with no family at his side and no obituary in the papers. The hospital staff, black and overworked, buried him in a segregated cemetery with a simple wooden marker that rotted within a decade. For a time, that seemed to be the whole of it. Then, in the middle of the 20th century, the country's appetite for uncomfortable history changed. It began, as such things often did, with a graduate student who was supposed to be looking for something else. Her name was Ruth Carter. In 1959, she sat in a dusty archive room in Washington, D.C., surrounded by boxes labeled Lincoln Medical and Assassination Reports, flipping through onion skin copies of documents that had not been touched in decades. She was not officially there to look for black people. Her dissertation was about presidential illness and the mythology of masculine strength in American politics. But she had grown up in a house where her grandfather, a retired Pullman porter, kept a small shrine to Lincoln and spoke, in a voice that shook with both respect and anger, about the promises that man made and this country broke. So when she found a reference, buried in a footnote of an 1866 report, to Observations by A.A., colored assistant, her heart kicked. A.A., no full name, no title, just 2 initials and a racial marker. Ruth requested the original notebooks cited in the footnote. At first, the archivist shrugged. "Those were lost in a fire," he said. "Which fire?" she asked. "The one in 1887, or perhaps the one in 1903, he said vaguely. Things get mislaid. Ruth had been told all her life that things with black origins had a habit of getting mislaid. She didn't stop there. She traced the citation backward, through an 1870 medical monograph by Horace Graves, to a catalog entry that did still exist. Unattributed case notes, craniocerebral trauma, 1864-65, donated by H. Graves, 1872. Unattributed, she repeated aloud, except for the AA you took out before you printed your own name on them. The archivist blinked at her, nonplussed. "Miss, I don't write the labels," he said. "No," Ruth said. But someone did. Her hunt moved from federal archives to hospital basements to the attics of old medical societies. In a battered trunk in a defunct Baltimore clinic, she found them. A bundle of notebooks tied with a fraying cord, pages brittle but legible, ink faded but stubborn. On the inside cover of the top notebook, written in a hand that was firm even when the lines wavered, were the words, "Alexander August, surgeon, for those who will not be allowed to ask, for those who will not be believed when they answer." Ruth read through night and into morning. She traced the progression of Lincoln's symptoms, the interventions, the setback in January, the improvement in March. She saw references to arguments with H.G. about credits and protocols. She saw in the margins notes about how white colleagues reacted when confronted with a black man holding expertise. She compared those notes with Graves's published papers. The theft was not subtle. Whole paragraphs had been lifted, with only minor rearrangement. Sentences that had begun in the first-person plural. "We observed." In the original now appeared as "I observed," under Graves's name. Ruth's hands shook by the end of the comparison. In 1963, she published an article in a medical history journal with a title that did not fully capture the weight of what she had found: Uncredited Contributions to the Management of President Lincoln's Cranial Injury. The article caused a small stir. Some older doctors sniffed that authorship practices were different back then. Some younger ones were outraged that a black surgeon's work had been so blatantly appropriated. Outside the narrow world of medical history, almost no one noticed. It would take another 50 years and another kind of hunger for unsanitized narratives for Alexander's story to make its way beyond specialized journals into documentaries, podcasts, and late-night arguments on the Internet. By then, America had lived through Brown vs. Board of Education, the March on Washington, Selma, the assassination of another man many people called a kind of president without a title. In that world, the idea that a black doctor had helped save Abraham Lincoln and been erased from the record no longer seemed implausible. It seemed depressingly predictable. When a modern historian finally stood in front of a camera and said, "Let's talk about the black surgeon who kept Lincoln alive for 6 months, and how his white colleague stole his legacy," the story landed not as a shock, but as a confirmation of what many viewers already suspected about whose names had been left out of their textbooks. In the closing minutes of that documentary, the camera panned across the worn cover of one of Alexander's notebooks. The narrator's voice dropped. "History remembered who pulled the trigger," she said. "It remembered the actor who shouted Latin from the stage and broke his leg in a leap toward infamy. It remembered the rope, the trapdoor, the graves. What it did not remember or did not want to remember was the black man who held a dying president's head in his hands, bought him 6 months of life, and then lost his own place in the story, to a colleague whose skin made him easier to celebrate. His name was Dr. Alexander August. He was not a rumor. He was not an assistant. He was not a footnote. He was the author of a piece of medical knowledge that saved lives long after he died, even as the country that benefited from it refused to say his name. Somewhere in a grave whose marker had long since rotted away, that might not have sounded like justice. But for the descendants of men and women who had been told, for generations, that their ancestors had contributed nothing but labor and song, it was something else. A reminder that the archive is not the whole memory. A warning that every tidy story about great white men is missing fingerprints. And a quiet invitation to go looking, again and again, for the names that were scrubbed out so thoroughly, someone thought they would never be spoken aloud on a screen, in a classroom, or into a microphone. Names like Alexander August,